Good morning. We discussed here to share some ideas to see when you started programming and some tips of how we learn to program. I'm not a good example of it. I studied computer science, but let's go around and see what you think, how you started and what type of tips and methods you use to improve your programming. Let's just start with Nat.
All right. Well, I actually started, or I did a little bit back before I first came to university for my bachelor's, Python mainly. And I just loved problem solving. And that's kind of, I think, what coding is. So I never quite dropped it. My bachelor's, we mostly did R, so it's not quite the same as Python. But I really wanted to get back into it. And a big aspect of wanting to do my master's research project with Payam was how much you could do in coding, machine learning. So yeah, that's kind of how I got into it. Tips, do we want to talk tips? I'd say learn to use as many libraries as possible and learn as many languages as possible. You never know when you're going to need to have the knowledge base of MATLAB, R, Python, HTML even. Things I wish I'd known sooner. Less things I wish I'd known sooner, perhaps, and more just kind of something I try to live by. The things that scare you, that you're most daunted by, if you feel better in one area of programming, machine learning than another, don't stay in your comfort zone. Focus on the areas that you're not comfortable on or in, because that's where you will, I think, experience the most development if you put yourself out there.
Now, if you rank yourself as a Python developer now out of 10, when you started, what was your score and where you are now?
I'm going to go with probably a 1 or 2 when I started. Where I am now, I think there's always room for growth. Maybe a 7 or an 8. Is that?
Not bad. Me? Yeah, so I started actually in MATLAB. Like Python, I only learned quite recently. For my bachelor's thesis, well, COVID hit, so I was kind of forced to go into a computational project, but it actually turned out to be quite an exciting opportunity because before that, I thought I was destined to be a wet lab scientist. And kind of going into analysis, I was like, okay, this is my opportunity to do something that scares me. I guess I'll get to learn how to code. So how I started, as actually one of my tips is to start small. So I did little MATLAB tutorials online. I asked for loads of help from my poor supervisor, but he was really amazing. So thank heavens for that. And actually having an objective and having a project to work on, like kind of added that extra motivation for it. So in the 3 months of my bachelor's project, I ended up learning how to use MATLAB quite effectively, which I'm actually really grateful for because yeah, and then I ended up choosing the MSc in Translational Neuroscience explicitly because of the computational elements to it, which I suspect actually a lot of you guys from the MSc might share in your experience. I ended up choosing a very computational project that was supervised by Gregory Scott, who also has a background in computing, just like you, Payam. And I just did pure coding in that project. I was mostly working with, again, MATLAB, and then I also learned Bash, so a second language. But it really helped to have started and having a strong foundation in one language and just kind of getting that mentality because you have like a specific way of thinking in coding. And then in this past year, since most of the best and optimal libraries for machine learning work is in Python, I switched over to Python. And having learned those other 2 languages, it actually the switch was much, much easier. It's just about kind of like changing the syntax a little bit. But once you learn one of the languages, it's much, much easier to pick up the others.
And how was the transition from MATLAB to Python?
Surprisingly okay. Like at first it's a little frustrating because I obviously by kind of like default just use the MATLAB syntax and obviously it doesn't work. But generally speaking, the way of thinking and the way of structuring your code has quite a lot of similarities. I also found that for the machine learning, so many more functions in Python were so much easier and much more cleanly defined. Like to build an SVM in MATLAB is much more messy than to build one in Python. And then, yeah, for my project where I'm using like all these different kind of machine learning models, the code is really repetitive and just very easy to use, whereas in MATLAB, it's not the same. So actually made my life a lot easier.
Interesting, because I learned the other way around.
Python and then MATLAB. Yeah.
What I found is how you debug your code between the different two environments. Which one do you find it easier to debug it?
I mean, now I'd say Python, but that's probably because like also I've got quite a bit more experience, and I mean everything I've said, like I think also all the stuff that I've learned in MATLAB on how to like think like a programmer really transferred really well in Python. And so now like since I have all these memories of really struggling in MATLAB, and I don't have that in Python because I've already learned quite a lot of lessons from MATLAB originally. So yeah, a lot of the mentality you learn from any of the languages is highly transferable. It's just a question of changing the syntax, really. Yeah. So yeah, and things I wish I'd known before. If your code doesn't work on the night after hours of debugging, leave it. Wake up the next morning, I swear it'll work after 10 minutes. That's me. Yeah, your turn.
So I did do coding in my undergrad. I studied biomedical engineering, so I was like expected to learn Python and MATLAB. However, just because I started it a bit earlier, like before the master's, doesn't actually change anything about the actual learning experience in itself. So, and then in my final semester at my undergrad, I did a machine learning project for cancer diagnostics. And that kind of led me to apply for the translational neuroscience masters because I wanted to get these computational skills in a sort of more medical related field. And I would say one of the things I wish I'd known earlier is to really just take advantage of all the resources that are already out there, because there's no reason to like have to make your life more complicated and figure it out yourself. Everyone is learning to code all over the planet and have developed very good ways of approaching different problems. And there are lots of resources that provide also tutorials, but also just cheat sheets and like an overview of all functions that are really required instead of having to try and remember everything. It's also a good thing to just be able to also ask the right question.
Yeah, learn how to Google.
Yeah.
You don't need to learn how to code, you just need to learn how to search things up.
Yeah, because if you can like use all the things that other people have already worked so hard on figuring out, you get further a lot quicker versus trying to just stay stuck and focus on your own code the whole time. It's easier to just broaden like the scope that you're looking at.
Pause there for a second, but I cannot code without using Stack Overflow.
Yeah, I don't think anyone can.
People ask questions about the coding problems, and sometimes I say if like internet goes down, I can't write any code anymore. Not at that level, but when you say getting resources and help, where is my home is go to Stack Overflow.
Yeah, Stack Overflow.
Or the documentation of a function. And
also helps.
Most libraries have very, very accessible like documentation, especially for the machine learning libraries, where you can just easily find out what are the different options, what does each variable even mean, and how is it like gonna influence what you're doing. So the combination of Stack Overflow and like the libraries.
Scikit-learn, for example, in Python's machine learning library, Scikit-learn has a brilliant documentation. It's one of the best I've ever seen, like very well documented, very, very good examples. But do you use Codepilot or ChatGPT's code pilot?
Sometimes if it makes things a bit quicker, but I'm actually really glad because when I learned how to code, we didn't have ChatGPT. Like I had to learn it properly manually, and that's completely invaluable because ChatGPT really just takes away a lot of your thought process and the whole kind of like problem solving aspect of it.
I would also say at the beginning when you learn to code, it's almost not, if you don't understand the basics, it's very hard to even understand what ChatGPT is telling you to do, like how to implement it,
how it works.
So like what the point even is of the overall like structure, like the code that ChatGPT can generate. So currently, I do use ChatGPT to like speed up the process, but I also am aware of what the point is behind the code that ChatGPT is writing. However, if I'd started directly just using ChatGPT, I probably would not be able to do things like debug my own code. And you can ask ChatGPT to debug code, but if it already wrote the code in the first place, it doesn't go so smoothly in its own debugging of itself because it thinks that's what you want.
Yeah.
So I would say learning like the basic skills is a very important step to being able to also utilize other methods to speed up the coding process, such as ChatGPT.
And I mean, some of the methods we use are also very niche. So
As well, like imaging stuff.
ChatGPT in the very short term can help to accelerate your work, but in the long term, if it's doing a lot of the basic work for you, it will slow you down because you don't have information already existing in your brain about how to answer a simple question or a more complicated question, how to think about a question, and how you might solve it. And I think what we'll learn over the course of this module is that machine learning is more than just coding. It's about the underlying theory and mathematics. And if you don't understand that, which I fear would have been the case for me if I had fully relied on ChatGPT from the beginning, you miss out on a lot of the fun of coding and machine learning. And I think a lot of the fun also just comes from figuring it out and having those very frustrating moments where it's you don't immediately have the answer, but when you do find it, I mean, it's what I loved about math all the way through up until the end of high school was you know, the challenge and then the reward that you feel when you solve the challenge completely independently or from integrating all the information you already have.
Before going to your programming experience and where you started, but like there's always the argument is why do I need to learn the mathematics behind this, or if I have a library and it does what it does, then I just need to learn how to give an input and get to output. Is there any advantage actually spending time and learning the maths behind?
I mean, I would say that there absolutely is an advantage to understanding what it is that you're doing, just like any problem where there's a quote unquote black box. I think as scientists, it's our job to understand what's happening between an input and an output. And I mean, my immediate answer to your question is that I find it really fascinating and fun to learn about, but I also think there's huge value, and I know not to take an idea that I know you will deliver to the course in a few weeks out of your mouth. There are a lot of, I mean, coding is going to become something that can be automated in a lot of ways. Mathematical thinking and an understanding of the theory is not going to be kind of autonomized in the same way. And so to have that really deep understanding of how these different algorithms work will keep you relevant in the world.
And I mean, even if you don't necessarily have a penchant for mathematics, just understanding the basics, the fact that machine learning comes from really simple maths really just kind of like demystifies the whole thing. Like it goes from being like a black box subject to being something that's actually quite understandable and achievable for anyone really.
Your own programming experience, but if you rank yourself when you started, where you started?
Well, you started where they started.
I started at 0. So
yeah.
I think, I don't know if we all mentioned this, but we did all do the translational neuroscience masters at different times. I came into this program with 0 coding experience, and I didn't think I was going to want to do a machine learning project. I had minimal exposure to it. I was really interested in neuroplasticity and neuroinflammation. And it was the course itself that introduced me and totally converted me to loving machine learning and coding. And so I did. I started at 0. I would certainly not say I'm near where Nan is at. So if Nan is at 7 or 8, then I'm at probably 4 or 5. There's a huge, huge opportunity for growth there. But it has been such a rewarding and exciting experience. It's frustrating sometimes, not understanding why your code isn't working, not feeling like, you know, maybe feeling like there was a way that you could have approached it that you just didn't know. So it's hard, and it's hard to structure your own learning in a completely new area. You're learning another language, but it's also really fun. As I mentioned before, math was always my favorite subject. Growing up, I know for Anastasia as well, it was. And there was a period where we had a bit of a falling out in undergrad. And it was sad because I really loved math and I really loved the analytical thinking and the problem solving that's involved, like a few of us have mentioned. And so it was really exciting to be able to have that back when I started learning how to code. And I think what's also so amazing about machine learning in this context is that it's applied to scenarios where people benefit enormously from the work that we do. And there's just a huge opportunity for impact. And so that has also been really fun. I've moved totally far away from how I learned to code. The answer to that question is through the modules. That was my introduction. It was definitely getting thrown in the deep end a little bit, but it definitely worked out in the end. I think I wish I would have had even more structure. I think the way that I was taught was very much, these are the important things to know in order to do specific neuroscience applications of coding and machine learning, as opposed to these are the basics of coding, period. And so there are some excellent, as Iona said, resources online for how to go about kind of refreshing your skills. I think practice is an excellent way. It's how I felt it was, I felt like it was also an excellent way to learn a lot of math concepts, but challenging yourself, there's lots of challenges online and tutorials that you can run through, and practicing the code, challenging yourself without just immediately finding the answers. That was really helpful for me. And again, as you have problems that are real that you have to solve, you'll start to learn more and more about how to use Python as a tool to answer those questions.
Thank you. Before we go to the final question, just the one question. When you rank yourself at level 5, just give us an example of how many hundreds of lines code you have written for your project.
I have no idea. Thousands probably.
Okay. When you say level 5, it's still be right.
Yeah.
It's very complex.
But it ends up like
Clarify.
it's
Yeah.
fast. You start off like really slow to like build scripts. It takes you forever. Like even just figuring out how to build a function took me such a long time, like to wrap my head around for loops and all of that stuff. But once like without you really realizing, when you have an objective, having an objective and having a project really helps with that. Before you know it, you're starting to just like every day you just get a little bit faster. And then next thing you know, you don't even have to think, like you don't have a eureka moment for every line of code you build. Like after a while, like you can go through an entire like a whole paragraph, a whole chunk of code, and then you get that eureka moment. So you get much more kind of familiar and comfortable with it.
I will say one thing that I think I have found ChatGPT to actually be helpful for me with, is a terrible sentence. When you're thinking about how to formulate a question for ChatGPT, sometimes I actually find the answer to my problem just by thinking about how, you say I have data in these 2 columns and I want to change it in this way, for example, very simple problem. I come to the solution just by thinking about how I would ask the question. It's kind of similar to how you're encouraged sometimes to teach something in order to learn it better. It's that kind of thing. So that's been helpful for me too.
Now, if you go back to day 1 of starting this MSc or starting this module, think of that day 1. There are 2 different things. There are 2 different objectives. One is you're going to finish a module and you have only like 2.5 weeks. You don't have time to go and read all these tutorials and think all this material. You want to have a quick sort of a learning curve to get there. And then you have a longer term sort of a goal of doing like a 6-month project or with the next stage of your study career. What would be your recommendation for the short term and the long term, and what you say to do or not to do? Now, sorry, I put you on the spot.
I would say, having done the same masters as Antigone mentioned, we've all done. I'd say the thing I would focus on is perhaps more the practical aspects of the modules, and particularly this module. I think you're probably going to learn the most. Sorry, this is awful considering you're about to deliver all these lectures, Payam, but I don't think take, what do they say, about 20 to 50% of the information the first time you hear it, but when you're actually working through something, I think you're taking on far more information than perhaps you even realize. So I think to sort of say you're feeling really exhausted, overwhelmed, I know it's a very intense course, this one. If you need to sort of decompress or need a break, I'd say choose to have those breaks not during the labs or the practicals. It's also when we're all going to be there to help you sort of work through those problems and to answer any of your questions. So I think that's perhaps going to be the best learning opportunity short term.
Building off of that, I think see this module as a contained unit and not an opportunity necessarily to explore every different avenue you could go down with coding and machine learning.
Absolutely.
We will provide you with the information that is necessary for you to be able to progress through this module and, you know, complete the assessments sufficiently. So don't feel like there's information that's being hidden from you or something you need to go out and really broaden your knowledge on in the next 2.5 weeks. Maybe see these as kind of exciting opportunities to look into when you have more time on your hands, but to save yourself the mental strain, there are no trick questions here. It's about kind of curating a good introduction to a very enormous field.
The module is what it is. It's intense. It will go by in a flash. It's not exactly the opportunity for you to, as you say, explore and go wild with it. It's much more kind of about like learning the material, get a basic understanding of machine learning and how it works, and like have a fundamental understanding of just, again, the basics of coding for the machine learning specifically. You will get an opportunity to learn how to code much more extensively during your project when you have one objective and a ton of time to like look into it, and that's when you're going to really have the time to properly explore everything. This is just a really good starting point.
Yeah, I mean, to build on the tutorial thing, though, I think it's also important to note that it will probably be quite tempting sometimes to just run through a tutorial, like the Jupyter Notebook code, and just like hit enter and just go all the way through and be like, oh yeah, that makes sense. I understand what this is. But it is quite important, I would say. Also, it will be important for the actual module, but also for like afterwards, to maybe force yourself a little bit to understand just some random lines of code that at first maybe feel really intuitive, but then if you look at them, you're like, well, what is this variable? Like, what is this actually doing? And what happens if I take it away? And, you know, how's that going to affect maybe some plot or something? Because it is quite easy to say to yourself, like, I do this as well. Oh yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, okay, quick, let's go next thing, you know, when you're stressed and busy. But that might lead to issues further down the line, for example, also during assessments. So especially something like there will be a PyTorch tutorial. It is quite easy to run through it and be like, that makes sense. But really ask yourself every line, does that actually make sense? Or does it just feel like it makes sense on the surface? Because it's not difficult to look up individual lines of code. You will understand it quite quickly. It just takes that extra 10 seconds usually to do so, and that will provide you with so much more information that is then applicable in many different scenarios, which is kind of worth doing if you just do it once correctly versus not doing it.
Try to explain it to your friends and teammates and see how well you can do that. Yeah.
Or change like
it's a really good way of identifying. Yeah.
If you change little things in the line of code, what happens to the output? How does that change? Do you get an error message? Why do you get the error message? That kind of stuff.
An opportunity in this module to do that, and it's not going to be like your master thesis, which you kind of do need your code to run and you want to output that you can use to write up on a paper. Whereas in this case, the whole idea is to learn what is happening, and it's probably until the master thesis, like it'll be not the only opportunity to do so, but it's very much the best opportunity to do so because you are provided with the time to literally ask those questions. And yeah, I would take advantage of that.
Thank you. Stop and record again, please. I'm really sorry. I'm really.
It's still recording.
I shouldn't have come here. How does that one laugh? Sorry, guys. We'll stop and record again.